Today we will be discussing the history of African American migration and European immigration to the small industrial city of Muncie, Indiana. We will examine the many factors that attracted these two demographic groups to Muncie over the span of 4 decades, from 1870 to 1910, while applying cultural, social, and racial historical lenses to aid in our analysis. Our interest in Muncie's foreign-born population, spurred from the research provided by Frank Felsenstein and James J. Connolly in their book, What Middletown Read, Print Culture in an American Small City, which examined both the role of literacy in Muncie and provided historical context about the community as a whole. In their assessment, the authors detailed the impact of the gas boom upon the cultural and demographic developments of Muncie throughout the late 19th century. We found interest in the fact that only a relatively small number of foreign-born residents lived in Muncie, including both African American migrants and European immigrants. The limited information provided by Felsenstein and Connolly prompted our investigation and discussion into each of these marginalized groups, as we saw the need for an in-depth research and the construction of a historical narrative.
In order to understand both the reasons and impacts of African American migration to Muncie, we must first begin at the national level. Beginning with the end of the American Civil War in 1865, which started a new era of growth within the United States. In the decades that followed the war's conclusion, large cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit saw substantial influxes of former slaves into their communities, as many sought new opportunities in the North. The rapidly industrializing economies and surplus of low-skilled manufacturing jobs in these urban areas attracted African Americans from throughout the United States, but mainly from the former Confederate states of the South. In Indiana, over 11,000 African Americans entered the state throughout the 1860s, although a black exclusionary law was in place until 1867. The turbulence of the Reconstruction era slowed the movement of African American migrants to the north throughout the 1870s and the early 1880s. But by the 1890s, large numbers of African Americans would migrate northward in search of social and economic opportunities. While the majority of these migrants would, as we have discussed previously, head to large cities, many would eventually find their way to small industrial cities like Muncie.
While the end of the Civil War would mark the beginning of African American migration to large urban centers in the North, the small industrial city of Muncie also saw an increase in its own foreign-born black population. From 1860 to 1870, the population of African Americans grew from 16 to 48, then to 187 in 1880. Throughout this period, jobs would be the main attractant for many migrants, as the Ball Company and other major employers established large industrial institutions, which provided the community with hundreds of low-skill manufacturing jobs. By the late 1880s and the early 1890s, the discovery of natural gas in Muncie would accelerate the growth of both the city's economy and the African American community. By 1890, Muncie's population consisted of over 400 African American residents, establishing the city as a major center for black migration within the state and prompting the development of African American neighborhoods.
The prosperity and large migration of African Americans as a result of the gas boom was met with the emergence of prolific black organizations and communities in Muncie, especially in the east, central, and southern regions of the city. In addition to establishing churches, African Americans organized their own wing in the Republican political party. This served as jurors for the county, enrolled their children in public school system, and faced comparatively less severe discrimination than in other parts of the state and the nation. In 1900, the African American population had nearly doubled in size from its previous census, and by 1910 had exceeded 1,000. As the African American population would continue to grow in the preceding decades, the impact and tenacity of the vibrant African American community in Muncie would continue to affect the history of the city as a whole and help pave the way for growth of other minority groups within Middletown, including the Irish and other European immigrants.
Now we will refocus our attention to the Irish immigrants that came to Muncie, Indiana during the late 19th century. We will dive deeper into the reasons as to why the Irish came to America and then specifically Muncie, while applying a cultural, social, and religious lens to aid us in our analysis. Through their example, we hope to provide a narrative reflection of the European immigrant community as a whole.
Before we discuss the Irish coming to Muncie, we must explore the reasons as to why the Irish came to America in the first place. The Irish came over to America from the result of the Irish potato famine from 1845 to 1849. The famine was caused by a fungus infection called Phytophthora infestans, and it ruined most of the crop during the span of the 5 to 7 years that the famine occurred. It caused about 1 million deaths in Ireland and another 1 million Irish people to leave the country and become immigrants. A majority of these immigrants came to America taking two major routes to get here. The first route, which was also the way that the majority of the Irish immigrants used, was by boat to one of the major East Coast ports. The main port that was used was the New York port, and another port that had a fairly large number of Irish immigrants that was not on the East Coast was the New Orleans, Louisiana port. New York was the most prominent port for Irish immigrants that eventually settled in Delaware County in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The second major route that was used by the Irish immigrants to enter America was to enter from Canada. They came over on Great Lake ships or they would cross by land. The second route was used more in the pre-Civil War era than after. However, there were many other minor routes that were used by the Irish to come to America, but they were lesser known and not as prominent than the other two major routes were.
The heaviest amount of Irish immigrants to Delaware County occurred in about 1870. This was a result of the gas boom in eastern Indiana. According to the 1870 Delaware County Census, the amount of Irish immigrants that immigrated there was less than 50. Out of these immigrants, there were men, women, and children, but the majority of them were men. Also, when looking at these immigrants, there was a variety of occupations that were held amongst them, with very few skilled and many unskilled. The few skilled jobs were things such as stonemasons, tailors, and tobacconists. Some of the unskilled occupations included butchers, servants, coopers, steam boilers, day laborers, farmers, merchants, railroad workers, and housekeepers. The most common of these were railroad workers, farmers, and housekeepers. Some immigrants, such as Barbara Fitzpatrick, who was born in Ireland in 1834, became widows and housekeepers many years before the potato famine, and lived out the rest of their lives in Muncie. You can see that she immigrated over to America more than likely during the potato famine or after, and then moved to Muncie or Delaware County, where she stayed like most Irish immigrants did. She also had one of the most common jobs for an Irish immigrant woman. Another immigrant by the name of Michael F. O'Toole was born in Ireland in 1878 and saw the effects of the Irish potato famine, but still moved to America like many other immigrants before him. He died in Muncie in 1971 at the age of 92, but while he did not live there, his occupation was a farmer, like many other Irish that came before him.
James P. Dolan is an expert in the field of Irish immigration, and in the introduction of his article, The Irish in America, he further proves our point that many Irish immigrants were workers and were involved in the American labor movement, and also that the Irish built strong urban communities and they were mostly working class people. He also talks about how religion played a huge role in the lives of the Irish immigrants, as Catholicism was the religion of choice for the majority of them. This may have also been why the Irish saw Muncie as a place for them to stay, because the opening of the St. Louis Catholic Church in 1869, right before the majority of Irish immigrants were coming to Muncie and Delaware County, was starting to grow as a result of the gas boom. When examining a list of the households in Delaware County, Indiana, 1880 census of Delaware County, Indiana, you will see that the amount of Irish immigrants that lived in Delaware County almost multiplied 5 times what it was in 1870. This number of Irish immigrants grew more and more with each following decade. The number of foreign-born inhabitants of Delaware County grew extensively throughout the early years of our project but started to slow down in growth towards the end.
Overall, you can see that both African American migration and Irish immigration played a pivotal role in the minorities that came to Muncie, Indiana during the years 1870 to 1910. Along with African Americans, the Irish contributed heavily to the development of Muncie's culture and economy, as their search for work would eventually result in the diverse communities seen today.